Well, thanks so much for the warm introduction. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you all here today at this incredible convening of 1,200 people seeking to improve outcomes for kids across Houston. So I'm going to talk today about changes we can make in our local schools, in our local communities to increase kids' chances of rising up and achieving upward mobility. But I want to start at a much bigger picture level by talking about the American dream, which is of course a multifaceted, complex concept that has different meanings to different people. I want to distill it in a first chart that we'll bring up in a second here that measures the American dream in one way, which is to ask, what are children's chances of rising up in the income distribution relative to their parents? A cornerstone aspect of the American dream that drew my own parents to come to this country and countless other immigrants. And so in a study my colleagues and I did a few years ago, we set about to assess the extent to which America actually lives up to this aspiration of being a country where, and let me just see if I can get the slides to advance here, of being a country where children do in fact rise up to have a higher standard of living than their parents. And so what you can see in this first chart here is just a simple measure of the fraction of children who go on to earn more than their parents did, measured by the year in which the child was born. And so if you look all the way back to the far left side of this chart, you can see that for kids born in the middle of the last century, back in 1940, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of upward mobility. We estimate that 92% of children born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did. But if you look at what has happened over time, you can see that there's been a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born in the middle of the 1980s, who are turning 30 around now when we're measuring their incomes as adults, it's become essentially a 50-50 shot, a coin flip as to whether you're going to achieve the American dream of moving up. So this dramatic trend of the fading American dream is of course of great interest to economists like myself, because it reflects a fundamental change in the American economy that we would like to understand. But I would argue it's also a fundamental social and political interest, because it's this very trend that underlies a lot of the frustration that people around the United States are expressing, that this is not a country where it's easy to get ahead even through hard work. And that's reflected in a lot of recent political discourse and social outcomes that we've seen in recent years. So motivated by this broad trend, in our research group at Harvard Opportunity Insights, we're interested in understanding the question of what is driving that fading of the American dream, and more importantly and more broadly, what can we do going forward to give kids of all backgrounds better chances of rising up? Now, we are, of course, by no means the only scholars or the first group to analyze that question. People have been interested in issues of social mobility and economic progress for centuries. Our angle on it is to use the tools of modern data, large-scale data that you see companies using, for example, to improve the products they offer, analogously to study questions like this. What are the drivers of the American dream, and how can we help people rise up? Now, one key thing that we can do with large-scale data is go beyond this national picture and start to look at what the American dream looks like in city after city, across different parts of the United States. And so let me show you what we've learned there with this map here, which shows you the geography of economic opportunity in America. Let me first take a second to describe how we constructed this map, and then tell you what I think we learned from it. So what we've done here is taken data on 20 million children, essentially all children born in the United States in the late 1970s, early 1980s. We use information from anonymized tax records to link those kids back to their parents and back to the exact location in which they grew up. We then divide the US into 740 different metro and rural areas, and each of those areas we construct a simple measure of upward economic mobility. We ask, suppose you grew up in a low-income family, which I'm going to define for the purposes of this talk as a family making $27,000 a year, which puts you at the 25th percentile of the US national income distribution. So say you're a kid growing up in a family making $27,000 a year. When we follow you over time and look at your own 1040 tax return when you're 35 years old, on average, how much money are you making? So you can see, for example, here in Houston, that number is $33,000. In the Boston metro area where I'm coming from, it's $37,000. And similarly, we construct that statistic for every metro and rural area in the United States. We color the map so that the red-orange colors represent places with lower levels of upward mobility, and the green-colored places represent places with higher levels of upward mobility. If you look at the lower right-hand side of the chart and look at that scale that's there, you can see first a very simple point that there's an enormous amount of variation in children's chances of rising up and achieving the American dream in different parts of America. There are some parts of the country, if you take rural Iowa, for example, kids growing up in families making $27,000 a year, one generation later, on average, are making $50,000 a year. A tremendous amount of upward mobility in a single generation. Yet you have other places, look at Charlotte, North Carolina, or much of the Southeast, where kids growing up in families at that exact same income level, $27,000 a year, one generation later, when they're 35, are actually making less than their parents were, which is shocking if you think about it, given the amount of economic growth that has occurred over the past 30 years in the US. Now, Houston, as you can see, we've labeled here, is kind of in the middle of the pack in terms of levels of economic mobility. It looks pretty good, actually, relative to most cities. When we look at how things are changing over time, we see that Houston has remained relatively stable, some modest improvements in levels of economic mobility over the past 10 or 15 years for kids growing up in the 90s and 2000s. But roughly, Houston looks good, but it's not at the highest levels of economic mobility that we might be able to achieve. Now, you can see the broad regional patterns here for yourself. The Midwest looks like it has higher levels of economic mobility than the Southeast, and so on. But it turns out that actually these differences in economic mobility play out at a much more granular level, at a neighborhood level. And so to show you that, let me now zoom in and show you the same exact data, neighborhood by neighborhood, here in Houston. So what we've done here is constructed the exact same statistics, but now we're doing it at the census tract level. Every census tract has about 4,000 people, and we're taking the set of kids who grew up in each of these different neighborhoods, following them over time, no matter where they move, and asking how much do they end up making in adulthood if they grew up in a low-income family. Now, the first very simple point I want to make is that we've not changed the color scale here, but you can see that you can go from the darkest reds to the deepest green colors right here within Houston if you drive a couple miles down the street. Now, you all know the geography of Houston better than me, and you can get a sense of which neighborhoods look better and worse and see if that accords with your own intuitions. But the first very simple takeaway here is that the origins of these differences in economic mobility, they're not about differences across states or differences across cities. No, it's often about what's happening on one side of the street versus another side of the street, one school district versus another school district. It's like you're going from Alabama to Iowa just when you drive a couple miles down the road right here within Houston. And so that shows you that, in a sense, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, going back to Carrie's remarks in the introduction, to really create opportunity for many kids in Houston, because there are many areas of Houston where kids growing up in low-income families really thrive, but unfortunately there are a number of others where they do not. And I think the key challenge for all of you and for all of us is to figure out how we can make that map look more uniformly green and not just have opportunity in some parts of the city and not others. Now, absolutely. Now, for us as social scientists studying this problem, this map, these kinds of maps are useful because they give us a new lens, a microscope, if you will, to study the science of economic opportunity. We can compare what is different about the red-colored neighborhoods and the green-colored neighborhoods. Are there differences in schools? Are there differences in other resources? What happens when a kid moves from one of the red-colored areas to one of the green-colored areas? We and many others over the past decade have used this sort of data to study a variety of different factors, from schools to housing to connections, all kinds of different things, to understand what the drivers of economic mobility are. In the interest of time, I'm going to summarize what that enormous body of scientific literature has found in this slide here by showing you the 4 strongest predictors of economic mobility that have been identified to date. So the first, and what brings many of you together here today in your own line of work, as you might expect intuitively, is the quality of local schools, both at the K through 12 level and in terms of access to higher education. There's no doubt that going to a better school, having better teachers, having smaller classrooms, better resources, all of these things we can measure very clearly in the data. We can see if you happen to have a better kindergarten teacher, 30 years later, you're earning significantly more, you're more likely to go to college, you have better life outcomes. No doubt education has a huge role to play. But we find that education is an important driver, but very consistent with Carrie's message, it's not the only driver. There are a number of other things that matter as well. What are those things? We find that places that have more stable family structures, more two-parent families, for example, it's just a fact in the data, they tend to have higher levels of economic mobility. We also find that places with less concentrated poverty, more mixed income neighborhoods, tend to have higher levels of economic mobility. Finally, we find that places with greater social capital tend to have higher levels of economic mobility. Now, I want to spend an extra minute on this idea of social capital because it's a term you might have heard in other contexts. It's a term that's been used for more than 100 years, but we've never been very precise about what exactly it means. Is it about community? Is it about the strength of connections? And I also want to emphasize it because in my view, it's actually perhaps the most important factor in driving economic mobility. So let me show you how we reach that conclusion. We do so by using another novel source of data. We set up a collaboration with Meta, the company that operates the Facebook social network platform, to measure social connections in the United States on an unprecedented scale. And let me show you what we found with this pair of maps here. So the map on the left is the same map of upward mobility constructed using tax record data that I started out with. The map on the right looks very similar, but it's completely different. It's a map constructed using Facebook data on a simple measure of the extent to which low-income people and high-income people are interacting with each other in each community. So what we're doing in the map on the right is taking data on 72 million users of Facebook and asking if you have below median income, if you're a low-income person on Facebook, what fraction of your Facebook friends are high-income people? We color the map on the right so that the green colors are places where low-income folks have more high-income connections, and the red colors are places where there's more disconnection by class. Now you can see the result here immediately for yourself. You don't need fancy statistics to figure this out. It's obvious that the map on the right looks incredibly similar to the map on the left. This turns out to be the single strongest predictor of economic mobility that anyone has identified to date. So in particular, places where low-income folks and high-income folks are interacting more tend to be places where kids from lower-income families are more likely to rise up in the income distribution. Why exactly is that? We don't know for sure. It could be that they're getting job referrals. It could be, I think more importantly, probably that they're getting inspired to pursue career paths that they would have never considered had they not been connected to someone who's gone to college who can show them a path to career in science or business that may not have been on the radar screen. Whatever the underlying mechanism, it's clear that this notion of cross-class interaction is extremely important for driving economic mobility, not just at the national level, but if you zoom in, and you can look this data up for yourself on our team's website, if you go to the Opportunity Insights website, you can type in your home address and look at all of these statistics that I've been showing you. You can see at the zip code level here in Houston, it's exactly the places where low-income kids are most disconnected from high-income families that they have the poorest chances of rising up. And so, beyond the interventions we've traditionally emphasized in the context of education, teaching, and so on, which is incredibly important, I think these other factors, like who you're connected to, the broader environment you're exposed to, the neighborhood you're growing up in, all contribute to driving economic mobility. So with that background on what we found in the research on economic mobility, in the last few minutes here, I want to talk about the goal of this convening. How can you take this kind of research and data and use it to actually take action to improve economic mobility here in Houston? Let me briefly, to set this up, describe the three approaches our team is taking in cities across America to try to foster economic mobility. We're focusing on three different areas that we think follow naturally from the kind of data I just showed you, which show you that differences in economic mobility emerge at a hyper-local level across neighborhoods and depend upon where you're growing up, who you're interacting with, and so on. If you have that kind of view of the world, I think you would naturally think about three different ways to increase economic mobility. The first is to reduce segregation. If there's some neighborhoods in Houston that offer better opportunities than others, Why don't we help more low-income families access those neighborhoods through things like affordable housing, housing voucher programs, changes in zoning, and so on. And I think all of that has quite a bit of potential and promise, and we've seen in other contexts can really drive economic mobility. A second approach is to try to take the places that are currently in the red colors and turn them into green colors through place-based investments. That can start from investments in K through 12 schools. Carrie talked about the remarkable progress that's been made in Houston on those dimensions. I think additionally, it could involve other place-based investments, revitalizing communities in terms of their connections to surrounding communities, things like transit and so on. There are a number of things you can do in that space. A third space, which I'm going to spend a little bit more time focusing on here, is the pipeline. Once we get through the K through 12 system, higher education and workforce training, Carrie emphasized that here in Houston, you have lots of kids getting to that first marker, the very nice illustration with the dots we were all holding up. 80%, more than 80%, 88% of kids end up graduating. But then what happens afterward? Are they getting to those jobs that are sort of the ultimate goal we're after of achieving upward mobility? I think there's a lot that can be done in this region in particular in strengthening higher education and workforce training systems. And so let me take a few minutes to wrap up and show you what I think can be done in that space. So in thinking about higher education and economic mobility in the US, I find it useful to visualize how our higher education system is contributing to economic mobility using this chart here. So just as our team has constructed publicly available statistics on economic mobility for every neighborhood in America, we've also constructed statistics on economic mobility for every college in America. Every college in America is represented by a dot on this chart, and we're showing you two different dimensions that determine how much a college contributes to economic mobility. On the vertical axis is what we're calling the upward mobility rate. So what this measures, using data on 30 million students from tax and Department of Education records, is it asks, suppose you're a kid from a low-income family, say in the bottom 20% of the US income distribution. After you attend one of these colleges, what are the chances that you yourself, when you're in your 30s, reach the top 20% of the income distribution, reach the upper middle class? So you can see that some institutions, like my own institution, Harvard, Stanford, MIT, those places look terrific on that dimension. The low-income kids who attend those colleges tend to reach the upper middle class and beyond at very high rates. But of course, the fraction of kids you send to the upper middle class is only one thing that matters for economic mobility. What also matters is how many low-income kids you have on campus to begin with. And that's what's shown on the horizontal axis, what fraction of the student body is coming from a family in the bottom 20%. And you can see on that dimension, the highly selective private colleges in America, like MIT, Stanford, and Harvard, and so on, have very few kids coming from low-income families, less than 3% of the student body coming from the bottom 20% of the income distribution. So just mechanically, it is not possible for these colleges to be contributing a whole lot to economic mobility because they don't have that many low-income kids on campus to begin with. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you can see that there are many colleges, including many here in Texas, that serve lots of low-income students and are doing a great service on that front. But unfortunately, if you look at the outcomes at those colleges, they don't look all that great. Not that many kids who attend those colleges end up reaching the upper middle class. Or if you use a different metric, achieve the living wage standards that Carrie was describing. And so one way to think about what the problem in the higher education system in the US in general and in Texas in particular is that there are basically no dots in the upper right side of this chart. There are very few colleges that both educate lots of low-income kids and help them reach the upper middle class. And that's the fundamental problem, in my view, that we need to fix. And you can see the potential solutions. Can you move those dots that are on the upper left over to the right? Can you increase access to those institutions? And on the other end, places like Rice and so on the other end of the spectrum, can you improve outcomes at the community colleges that are currently serving many low-income students? So how can we go about doing that? Let me leave you with one final set of thoughts that may be informative on that front. I find in cases like this, it's often useful to look at exceptions and try to learn from them. Here's one exception, the Vaughn College of Aeronautics and Technology, which happens to be in the upper right here. It's a college that does exactly what you'd think, given its name. It trains people in aeronautics and technology in Queens, New York. And it's a small college that educates lots of kids from lower and middle income families. And as you can see here, gets them into careers that are pretty high paying and helps them reach the middle class. So that's an example of what I basically think of as modern day vocational training. And it's a path that I think is something that could be implemented more broadly, could be brought into our community colleges in different spheres, and potentially could create pathways to upward mobility for many kids. Now, it's not just this one example where we're seeing this kind of approach being really successful. We're now studying a number of different workforce training programs. I'm giving you one example here, a program called Year Up, which is a job training program that lasts for about a year, connects people to internships, gives them new skills. And when we look at kids who have participated in Year Up in a randomized trial, following them over time before they participated in the program, when they then enroll in the program, and then afterward, we see that people who participated in Year Up, by the flip of a coin, got access to the program, end up earning about $9,000 more per year than a control group of folks who didn't get access to the program, shown in the orange line. And you can see that these gains are incredibly durable from just this one-year intervention that gives people access to very different career opportunities. And so this is just one example. I think these kinds of programs have great potential to build on top of what you're already doing in the K through 12 system to make a dent in some of the numbers that Carrie was describing initially. Let me end here with one final set of data that I think is a different frame to think about the questions you all are working on. I think working on economic mobility is extremely important to level the playing field and give all children the chance to achieve their potential. But I think it's also extremely important just purely from a business and economic growth perspective. If you simply wanted to maximize sort of the total economic output, GDP of the Houston area, you would still want to focus on the same exact issues. And just to underscore that, let me show you this final chart here, where what we've done is linked data on patents to tax records to look at who goes on to become an inventor in America. And what you can see is that kids from high-income families, the top 1% of the income distribution, are 10 times more likely to become inventors as kids from lower-income families. Now, the reason I show this here in conclusion is that this illustrates that if we help more kids come through the pipeline and achieve better outcomes, it not only is going to improve their own earnings, but it's going to lead to new discoveries, new companies, new jobs that will end up benefiting all of us. And we estimate that the magnitude of this problem is quite substantial. In a sense, there are an enormous number of lost Einsteins because we're not tapping into that potential that lies in those red-colored neighborhoods. We estimate that we'd have 4 times as many inventors in America if kids from underrepresented minority backgrounds, lower-income families, and women were to invent at the same rate as higher-income white men. And so in that sense, the issues that you all are gathered here to discuss today, I think are of fundamental importance, not just for advancing kids' lives in Houston, which is incredibly important, but also more broadly for the productivity of this region and the success of the US in general. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk with all of you and look forward to the progress you'll make. Thanks so much.